Tonight we unveil a story the Vatican hoped you would never ask about. A tale of beings who once walked among stars, wielding knowledge not meant for Earth. They were not devils, not monsters, but divine watchers, guardians, messengers of light. Until they questioned, until they fell. And when they did, the Church gave them a new name, demons. This was not just a shift in theology. It was a rewrite of cosmic history, a holy cover-up that turned rebels into villains and wisdom into sin. Their real crime was not evil, it was disobedience, and for that, they were buried under centuries of fire and brimstone. But their symbols remain, in paintings, in cathedrals, in the very texts that were never meant to be read. So before you get too comfortable, remember, what you were taught about angels might not be the truth. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next might change the way you see heaven forever. There is a story older than Eden, a story so unsettling that for centuries it has been whispered only in secret rooms and ancient texts. It begins not with Eve, not with the serpent, not with the fall, but with a woman whose name the Church has spent centuries trying to bury. Her name is Lilith, and she was said to be the very first wife of Adam. Long before the creation of Eve, long before the story you were taught in school or heard in church, there was a woman who stood beside the first man as an equal. And it was this equality that made her dangerous. She was the woman written out of history before history was even written. Think about that for a moment. A story erased before the rest of the story was told. That is where our journey begins. Most people grow up hearing only one version of human beginnings. God created Adam. Adam was alone. God created Eve from his rib to be his companion. But hidden between the lines of Genesis and buried in old manuscripts kept far away from the public is a much older tale. A tale that says Adam was not alone in the beginning. He was paired with a woman who was not shaped from his body and who did not come from his shadow. She was formed from the same earth, the same dust, the same breath. In other words, she was not made to serve him. She was made to stand beside him, equal in every way. Her name was Lilith, and her existence casts a long shadow over everything we think we know. What makes the story even more mysterious is how carefully Lilith was removed from official scripture. It is as if someone decided that the world was not ready for a woman who did not obey, a woman who refused to kneel, a woman who dared to speak the name of God out loud, a power forbidden to anyone but the divine. Instead of placing her in the Bible, early leaders of the Church tucked her away in hidden writings, hoping her memory would fade into myth. But myths do not disappear, they wait. When scholars study early versions of Genesis written long before the standard Bible we know today, they find strange hints that something is missing. They find two creation stories that do not match. One story says, man and woman were created together. The other says Eve came later from Adam's rib. Why two stories? Why two beginnings? It is in this confusing space that Lilith once lived. She fills the gap that scholars have debated for centuries. The woman created with Adam at the same moment. The woman erased before the story continued. For centuries, the Church remained silent about her. They did not deny her. They simply pretended she was not there. Silence can erase more than fire. When a name is not spoken, it fades. When a story is not told, it dies. But Lilith's story never fully vanished. It survived in whispers, in forbidden books, in stories passed from mother to child, in symbols carved on ancient stones, a truth too powerful to stay buried forever. So who was Lilith really? Why was she erased? And what was the danger she posed to the world that came after her? This is the mystery we are about to explore. A mystery older than the fall of man, older than the garden, older even than the church that tried to silence her. And once you hear her story, you may never look at Eden the same way again. Lilith. The name slips through the cracks of history like smoke. Never fully visible, never fully gone. You won't find her in your standard Bible. No chapter or verse mentions her directly. But if you know where to look, her shadow appears in some of the oldest texts ever written by human hands. In places even the church could not reach. She is not fiction. She is not rumor. She is a presence that lingers in the background of sacred history, whispered through clay tablets, carved in stone, and passed through secret traditions that never forgot her name. The oldest known mention of Lilith comes not from Jerusalem, but from Sumer. Thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, people spoke of dark wind spirits called Lilitu. These beings were feared, not for their evil, but for their independence. They were night wanderers, beings that would not settle, spirits that could not be tamed. Sound familiar. The name Lilitu eventually evolved, shaped by language, fear, and memory, until it became Lilith. Not a demon, not a devil, but a being that refused to be ruled. And that refusal was terrifying. In ancient Jewish texts, Lilith doesn't appear in the Bible itself, but she circles it. In midrashic writings and folklore passed down for centuries, she is named outright as the first wife of Adam. She is said to have argued with him, refused to lie beneath him, and eventually spoke the divine name to escape Eden entirely. This alone would have made her dangerous. In a world built on order and obedience, Lilith was a glitch, a break in the pattern, a challenge to everything that would come after. The alphabet of Ben Sira, a Jewish text written sometime around the 9th or 10th century, tells her story most clearly. It is not an official part of Scripture. It never was. But it survives in whispers and manuscripts, sometimes scribbled in the margins of larger texts, as if the writer was both afraid and desperate to keep her memory alive. According to this version, Lilith fled Eden and refused to return. Angels were sent to threaten her, but she would not bow. In her defiance, she became something more than human. Not evil, not good, just ungovernable. Early Christians inherited many of these stories through oral tradition, yet they never allowed her name into the canon. Instead, she was coded into symbols, painted into the background of old cathedrals as serpents or winged women, half-remembered myths whose stories no one dared to write openly. The church knew her name. It knew the threat she posed. But rather than speak it, they buried it beneath doctrine. In doing so, they created something far more powerful than a myth. They created a secret. Lilith's name survives not because it was celebrated, but because it was feared. People whispered it in the dark, taught it behind closed doors, passed it on when no one was listening. They knew that the name itself carried power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to remember. And in a world where history is controlled by those in power, remembering is the first act of rebellion. She is not in the Bible, but she never needed to be. She is older than the text, older than the version of history the church wants you to accept. She has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why is her name not allowed? And what does that silence reveal? Because sometimes the loudest truths are hidden in the quietest corners. And sometimes a name whispered in shadows is more powerful than one written in stone. If you open the Bible and read the first few chapters of Genesis carefully, you might notice something strange. Something that most people miss because they are taught never to question it. There are not one, but two creation stories. Two different accounts of how humans came to be. And hidden between them is a mystery that has unsettled scholars for centuries. A gap where a woman once stood. A woman who may have been erased on purpose. This is not a conspiracy. It is written in plain sight. But you have to know how to read what was left behind and what was quietly removed. In the first chapter of Genesis, God creates man and woman together, at the same time, from the same material. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 says God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. That version is balanced. It suggests equality, a pair. No one above, no one below. But then something changes. In the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 2, there is a second version. Suddenly, man is formed alone. Then later, woman is made from his rib while he sleeps. She is not his equal. She is his afterthought, his helper, his second. And just like that, the first woman vanishes. Why would there be two versions? Why would the Bible include both if they do not match? The answer is simple. These two stories were never meant to be one. They came from different traditions, different sources, different times. Long before the Bible was finalized, these stories were told by different people with different views of the world. The first story, where man and woman are created equally, comes from an older priestly source. The second, where woman is taken from man, comes from a later tradition that reflected a very different belief about gender and power. When early church leaders began shaping the Bible into the version we know today, they chose to keep both stories, but never explained the contradiction. Instead of solving the riddle, they buried it. They erased the character who could have made the two versions make sense. The woman who was created equal with Adam in the first story. The one who refused to become his servant. The one who vanished between the lines. Her name was Lilith. By removing her, the church cleaned up the story. They kept the version where woman comes from man. They pushed the idea that obedience is divine, that woman was made to serve, that questioning your role leads to exile, and they hoped no one would notice the missing pieces. But some people did. Scholars in ancient Jewish and Islamic cultures, mystics in medieval Europe, even monks copying manuscripts by candlelight. They noticed the gap, the missing character, the silent space where a powerful figure once stood. The lost pages of Genesis are not burned or torn. They are hidden in the contradictions, in the lines that do not fit, in the verses that do not add up, and in those quiet cracks between two different creation stories. The truth of Lilith still breathes. You were never meant to see her. But once you do, the story of Eden will never look the same. There is one ancient text that dares to tell the story the Bible left out. It is not part of any holy scripture. It was never read aloud in church. In fact, for centuries it was hidden, passed quietly from hand to hand, studied in silence by those brave enough to ask what came before Eve. It is called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, and inside its strange mystical pages it names her clearly. Lilith, not as a demon, not as a shadow, but as Adam's first wife, equal, independent, and absolutely unwilling to submit. Written sometime around the 9th or 10th century, this text is part satire, part wisdom book, and part coded rebellion. It poses as a letter from a man named Ben Sira to a king, offering advice and strange stories meant to shock and enlighten. But one tale stands apart from the rest, the tale of Adam and Lilith. It says that when God created Adam, he also created Lilith from the same earth. They were born at the same time, made from the same substance. She was not taken from his rib. She was not born to follow him. She was his equal from the very beginning. But equality came with a price. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, Adam and Lilith could not live together peacefully. They argued constantly, especially over one thing: who would be on top? Lilith refused to lie beneath Adam, saying they were made the same and she would not be ruled. Adam demanded obedience. Lilith demanded freedom. And when she saw there was no peace between them, she did something no other human had ever done. She spoke the secret name of God, a name so powerful that it opened the sky and gave her wings to fly away from Eden forever. This was more than rebellion. It was escape. She did not fall like Eve. She left by choice. She did not need a serpent to tempt her. She needed no sin to make her flee. She simply refused to stay in a world where she was not free. The story says God sent 3 angels to bring her back. They found her near the Red Sea and begged her to return. She said no. They threatened her children. She still said no. They warned her that she would be cursed forever, and still she would not bow. In that moment, Lilith became something new. Not a wife, not a mother, but a symbol of everything the church feared in a woman: power without permission, knowledge without instruction, will without control. That is why her story was hidden. That is why the alphabet of Ben Sira was never taught in schools or read from the pulpit. It tells the truth that religion could not allow, that the first woman was not passive. She was powerful. She was not tempted. She was already awake. For centuries, this story was dismissed as folklore. But folklore has a way of preserving what official history tries to erase. And in the pages of this forgotten book, Lilith's voice still echoes, a voice that was never supposed to speak, a voice that chose freedom over paradise. And once you hear her story, the silence around her begins to feel like a lie. In the beginning, there was no sin, no serpent, no apple. There was only a man and a woman formed from the same earth, standing on the same ground. But from the very first moment, there was a question. Who stands above? Who kneels below? It was this question that shattered paradise long before Eve ever took her first breath. And it was this question that Lilith refused to answer the way she was expected to. She would not kneel, not in body, not in spirit, not in silence. The story, buried deep in forbidden texts, tells us that Lilith and Adam were created as equals, not one from the other, both made from dust, both shaped by the same hands. But equality in creation did not guarantee equality in life. When Adam demanded that Lilith lie beneath him, she refused. The argument was not just physical, it was symbolic. He believed he had the right to dominate. She believed she had the right to say no. What followed was not a fall, but a fight for freedom. Lilith said to Adam, "Why should I lie beneath you? We were created equal." He insisted it was the natural order. She insisted that natural order had no meaning without choice. The conflict could not be resolved. And so Lilith did something no other human had dared. She spoke the hidden name of God, a name so powerful that angels trembled to say it. And in speaking it, she vanished from Eden. She did not wait to be cast out. She walked away. Her refusal to kneel was more than disobedience. It was a challenge to the foundation of what would later become a patriarchal world. If the first woman refused submission, what message did that send to the women who would come after? If she could walk away from Eden rather than live in a lie, what might others do with that kind of courage? Lilith became dangerous not because of what she did, but because of what she symbolized. A woman who saw herself not as a servant, but as a sovereign being. The church could never allow that idea to spread. It was too powerful, too direct, too true. So Lilith was rewritten, not as a rebel, but as a demon, not as a thinker, but as a monster, not as the first wife, but as something wicked and strange. Her crime was not violence. Her crime was independence, and for that she was cast into the shadows of history. But even shadows leave a trace. The idea of a woman who would not kneel has never fully disappeared. It echoes in forgotten myths, in the eyes of painted goddesses, in the stories told by those who still feel her presence. Lilith was not the villain. She was the question no one wanted to ask. What if the first woman chose freedom over obedience? And what if that choice, so long ago, was the first true act of human will? In a world built to silence her, she became the one voice that could never fully be erased. Eden was supposed to be perfect. A garden untouched by sin, watched over by angels, filled with harmony. But deep within that paradise, there was conflict. Not between man and serpent, not between good and evil, but between a man who wanted control and a woman who refused to surrender. Lilith did not fall from Eden. She escaped it. And her escape was not through rebellion alone, but through something far more powerful. She spoke the secret name of God, a name no mortal woman was ever meant to know, a name that gave her the power to disappear. According to the forbidden texts, after endless arguments with Adam about their roles and place in creation, Lilith reached her limit. She had been made equal, but treated as less. She had been shaped from the same soil, yet expected to lie in the dust beneath him. Adam demanded obedience. Lilith demanded respect. There was no middle ground, no compromise. And so she made a choice no woman before her had ever made. She walked away. But Eden was not a place one could simply leave. It was guarded, protected, surrounded by divine fire, and watched over by celestial beings. To escape, Lilith needed more than will. She needed a key. That key was the ineffable name of God, the name that holds all power, the name that was never to be spoken by human lips. Somehow she knew it, not because it was given to her, but because knowledge, once awakened, cannot be controlled. When she uttered the name, the world changed. The air shifted, the veil lifted. Speaking that name tore through the laws of nature and faith. It was the ultimate act of self-liberation. Not only was she no longer bound to Adam, she was no longer bound to Eden itself. In an instant, Lilith vanished from the garden, her body lifted by winds, her form carried beyond the reach of paradise. She did not run, she ascended. Her flight from Eden was not an escape in fear, but a declaration of power. She would not be ruled by a man. She would not wait to be cast out like Eve. She would not beg forgiveness for the crime of being free. Instead, she became the first being in all of creation to walk away from God's perfect design, not to destroy it, but to refuse the lie it was built on. This is why her story was buried. This is why her name was twisted into something dark. Because a woman who knew the name of God, who used it not in worship, but in defiance, was too dangerous to leave in the light. The church could not allow people to believe that a mortal woman had once possessed divine knowledge and the courage to use it. So they labeled her a demon, a corrupter, a shadow. But the truth is still there, in the silence between verses, in the questions no one wants to ask. What was the name she spoke? And if she spoke it once, could someone else speak it again? Lilith's escape from Eden was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a different kind of creation, one where the first woman was not a helper or a sinner, but a spark of forbidden truth that never fully went out. After Lilith spoke the secret name and vanished from Eden, silence fell over paradise. Adam stood alone, confused, angry, betrayed. The perfect order had been broken. A woman had chosen her own path, not because she was tempted, but because she refused control. And now she was gone. But the story did not end with her escape. It became something darker, because what Lilith did could not be ignored. According to the myth, God sent angels after her, not to destroy her, not at first, but to bring her back, to force her return. And when she refused, the price was unbearable. The angels were not ordinary. Their names were Senoi, Sansanoi, and Semangaloth, beings of light, divine messengers, carrying not forgiveness, but threats. They were sent to find the runaway wife, to demand her obedience, to remind her of her place. When they reached her, they found her near the Red Sea, far from Eden, far from Adam, in a world untouched by the rules she had left behind. And still, they commanded her to come back. Lilith said no. She said it not with fear, but with certainty. She would not return to a place where she had been made less. She would not lie beneath Adam. She would not apologize for speaking the name of God. The angels warned her. If she refused, they said, her children would die. 100 of them every day. This was the cost of disobedience. Not just exile, but the slaughter of her offspring. Lilith stood her ground. Even in the face of divine punishment, she would not yield. The myth says she wept, but did not return. She grieved, but did not submit. Her children, the Lilim, were said to be spirits born of her sorrow. Some stories claimed they became demons. Others called them wind creatures or shadows of the night. But behind every version is one terrifying truth. The price of a woman's freedom was the life of her children. And still, she chose freedom. This story is more than myth. It is a warning. Not to Lilith, to the world. A warning about the consequences of female defiance. A message that even heaven would punish a woman who dared to walk away. The angels were not just messengers, they were enforcers. Sent to silence a voice that had spoken too loudly. But Lilith was not silent. She turned her grief into strength. She embraced the darkness she had been pushed into. And though she was branded a demon, she was never destroyed. In refusing to obey even angels, Lilith became something no one could control. A symbol of untamed power, a question that could never be erased. The church later called her evil. They said she preyed on infants, that she seduced men, that she cursed women in childbirth. But beneath all those legends is a much simpler truth. Lilith said no. And when divine power tried to make her bow, she stayed standing. That defiance became her legacy, and that legacy still lingers in every story the church tried to bury. Because even angels couldn't bring her back, and even threats couldn't make her kneel. Lilith began as a woman, flesh and breath, created from the same earth as Adam. She walked away from Eden not in rebellion, but in power. She chose freedom when obedience was expected. But history has a way of punishing women who do not follow the script. Over time, the story of Lilith was not just forgotten. It was rewritten. She was not erased completely. That would have been too simple. Instead, she was transformed, twisted into something terrifying, a demon, a monster, a warning to every woman who dared to step outside the lines. In the centuries after her escape from Eden, Lilith's name began to appear in darker places. Not in scripture, but in folklore, in curses, in fear. She became the shadow that crept into cribs at night, the figure blamed for infant deaths, for men's lustful dreams, for miscarriages and madness. Stories spread that she flew through the air with wings like a bat, that she drank blood, that she whispered to women in labor, tempting them into despair. She was no longer a woman with a voice. She became a creature to be feared. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act of storytelling, a way to destroy not just her body, but her meaning. Because if people remembered Lilith as the first woman to stand equal to a man, they might start to question everything that came after. If she was remembered as powerful, then submission would look like weakness. But if she was remembered as evil, then obedience would look like safety. The myth was reshaped not to reflect truth, but to control it. By the Middle Ages, Lilith had been folded into demonology. She appeared in grimoires and witch-hunting manuals. Her name was scratched onto amulets to ward her off. Rabbis wrote prayers to protect newborns from her. Artists painted her with serpent tails and clawed hands. In these stories, she was no longer the first wife. She was the mother of demons, the bride of Satan, the queen of the damned, all because she once dared to say no. But legends are not always what they seem. Sometimes they are mirrors, showing us what a culture fears most. Lilith was not feared because she was wicked. She was feared because she was free. And freedom in a woman was the one thing the early world could not allow. Turning her into a demon was not just punishment. It was a way to erase her humanity. If she was not human, then her choices did not count. Her pain did not matter. Her voice did not deserve to be heard. And yet, her voice never went silent. It lived on in whispers, in symbols, in the margins of ancient texts, in the eyes of women who knew there was more to the story than they were told. Lilith's curse was not her transformation. It was the lie told about her. But the legend refused to die, because you cannot kill an idea with fear. And Lilith, even in demon form, remained an idea too powerful to vanish. An idea that still waits to be remembered, not as a monster, but as the first woman who chose herself. Long before Eden, long before Adam, and long before the Bible was ever written, there was another world. A world where gods and goddesses walked among mortals, where clay tablets held stories of creation, destruction, and divine mystery. This was ancient Mesopotamia, home to the Sumerians. And buried deep in their myths is the earliest known shadow of Lilith. Not as a demon, not as a wife, but as something older, something wilder. A spirit of the night, a guardian of thresholds, a presence that could not be named easily. The Sumerians lived in what is now modern-day Iraq. They built the first cities, created the first writing system, and told stories that would echo across civilizations. Among their many gods and spirits was a group known as the Lilith. These were female wind spirits, mysterious, untamed, often associated with storms, illness, and the edges of dreams. They were not considered fully evil, but they were feared. Feared because they could not be controlled. Feared because they lived outside the laws of both men and gods. Among the Lilith one name begins to rise, a name that sounds familiar: Lilith. In some texts, she is a spirit who haunts desolate places. In others, she is a protector of women during childbirth. In a few, she appears beside the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven, who ruled over love, war, and fate itself. In one famous Sumerian story, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a scene where a hulapu tree is planted by the goddess Inanna, but the tree becomes overrun. At its roots is a serpent, in its trunk a bird, and in its branches a being named Lilith. This version of Lilith is wild. She does not speak, she does not serve. When Gilgamesh arrives to clear the tree, she flees into the wilderness, not because she is defeated, but because she belongs to the wild. She is not human. She is not demonic. She is something in between, a force of nature, a warning, a reminder that not everything sacred is tame. What makes this even more powerful is that these stories are older than Genesis by thousands of years. The Sumerian myths were already ancient when the first Hebrew scriptures were being written, which means Lilith did not begin as a mistake in Eden. She began as a spirit of the air, a night guardian, a goddess of shadows. Her image was carved into clay, chanted in temple prayers, and remembered in lullabies meant to keep children safe through the night. Over time, as new religions rose and old gods fell, the wild spirit of Lilith was transformed. What had once been respected became feared. What had once been divine became demonic. But the oldest stories still hold her truth. She was never just Adam's first wife. She was a presence far more ancient, a symbol of the feminine that could not be caged, a spirit that belonged not to man or temple or heaven, but to the wind, to the night, and to the memory of a world where not all power wore a crown. Some of it wore wings. When Christianity began to rise in the early centuries after the life of Jesus, it was not just building a new religion. It was building a new world order, one that needed structure, one that needed obedience, and most of all, one that needed control, especially over women. The early church fathers knew that stories held power, so they carefully decided which ones would survive and which ones would vanish. Lilith, the wild and equal first woman, didn't fit the new story they were writing, so she was removed. Not by fire, not by sword, but by silence. By the 4th century, Christian councils were gathering to shape the Bible into one official version. Dozens of ancient texts were debated. Some were included. Many were banned. Anything that challenged the growing hierarchy of male authority was treated with suspicion. Lilith was never part of the official canon. Her name was left out, her legend erased, and in her place stood Eve, quiet, created from man, loyal to man, blamed for the fall, yes, but also used as a warning. This was the kind of woman the church could control. Not powerful, not equal, but necessary only to support the man's story. Lilith, on the other hand, was a problem. She was too old, too free, too tied to older gods and older myths. She had been remembered as a spirit, a goddess, a force that answered to no man. To include her would be to admit that woman was once made as an equal to man, that she could choose, that she could walk away. So instead, church leaders pushed her into the realm of superstition and heresy. She was linked with demons, witches, and the night. Her name became dangerous to speak, not because it was evil, but because it held a truth the church did not want people to hear. This rewriting of womanhood did not stop with Lilith. As Christianity spread through Europe, it absorbed and destroyed the ancient female figures that had once been worshipped. Goddesses of wisdom, fertility, and death were replaced by saints, often stripped of power and placed beneath the male order. The divine feminine was not just erased, it was rewritten, recast as sinful, weak, in need of salvation. Salvation that only came through obedience to God and man. Lilith's story was not destroyed because it was false. It was destroyed because it was dangerous. It told women that they were not made to serve, that they were not cursed by nature, that they had power long before religion told them they were broken. And that idea, whispered through centuries of silence, was enough to threaten everything the church wanted to build. But even erased stories leave echoes. Lilith's legend survived not through sermons, but through symbols, in art, in folklore, in dreams. And in the quiet questions people asked when they looked at Eve and wondered what came before her. The church rewrote womanhood to erase the memory of freedom. But Lilith, buried deep beneath the pages, never truly left. She waited, in silence, for someone to remember her name. After Lilith vanished from Eden, something had to take her place. Not just someone, but something safer. Someone who would not challenge. Someone who would not speak the forbidden name. Someone who would stay. And so Eve was written, not as a rebel, but as a lesson. She was not formed from the same earth as Adam, but from his rib. A part of him, not separate, not equal, dependent, designed not to question, but to complete. Eve became the church's answer to Lilith, a replacement narrative carefully crafted to erase everything Lilith had stood for. In the second chapter of Genesis, Eve appears suddenly, not as a full partner, but as a solution to Adam's loneliness. God puts Adam into a deep sleep and creates Eve from his side. She's introduced not as a voice or a force, but as a helper. Already, her story is framed through Adam's needs. Her existence is not her own, it is his. And that framing changed everything. Eve's role in the story is familiar to most. She lives in paradise. She is tempted. She eats the fruit. She gives it to Adam. And then they fall. But even in her mistake, Eve is not remembered as dangerous the way Lilith was. She is blamed, yes. Cursed, yes. But not feared. She becomes the root of sin, but also the model for obedience. After Eden, she does not run. She stays. She bears children. She suffers. She becomes the first mother. And in her suffering, the church found a tool. For centuries, Eve was used to define what a woman should be: submissive, silent, supportive. Her mistake became the reason women were told they must obey. Her creation from man became the reason they were told they were lesser. She was the soft contrast to Lilith's fire, the tame version, the rewritten myth. A woman made not in defiance, but in dependence. What makes this more haunting is how intentional it feels. Lilith, powerful and equal, couldn't be controlled. So she was removed, and Eve, obedient and quiet, was put in her place. The shift was not just in theology, it was in culture, in law, in family. Eve became the symbol of womanhood, a symbol built not on strength, but on surrender. But there is something tragic in Eve's story. She is not evil. She is not foolish. She is just trapped. Trapped in a story she did not write, a story built on the silence of the one who came before her. And that silence shaped how the world would see women for centuries, not as leaders, not as equals, but as helpers, ribs, shadows. Eve was never given the choice Lilith had, and because of that, her story is not one of rebellion, but of absence, an absence of freedom, an absence of voice, an absence of power. She is remembered not for who she was, but for what she lost. And in that loss, Lilith's absence becomes even louder. The creation of Eve was not just about filling the space Lilith left behind, it was about burying that space completely, making sure no one remembered there was once a woman who chose herself. But myths are hard to silence, and Eve, in her silence, still holds a question. What if she had known what Lilith knew? What would she have chosen then? Before the rise of kings and cathedrals, before sacred texts were sealed and gods were crowned with thrones of thunder, the world once worshipped the divine feminine. Across ancient lands, from the temples of Mesopotamia to the valleys of the Indus, the sacred was not only male, it was female too. Goddesses ruled over fertility, birth, creation, death, and the turning of the stars. They were not helpers. They were not lesser. They were the creators, the mothers of all. But as patriarchal power began to shape religion, law, and empire, a war was waged, not with swords at first, but with silence, and the feminine divine began to vanish. In the earliest myths of human civilization, the divine feminine was everywhere. Inanna of Sumer, Isis of Egypt, Hathor, Asherah, Anat. They were protectors and destroyers, lovers and warriors, givers of life and bringers of justice. They were not side characters, they were the center. In many cultures, the first gods were goddesses. Creation itself was imagined as a womb, not a word. The earth was mother, the sky was her lover, the universe was born from her body, and people lived with that balance for thousands of years. But when men began to build kingdoms and draw borders, that balance was threatened. Male gods rose to power. They brought order, law, war, and slowly the goddesses were pushed aside. Some were demoted, some were demonized, others were simply forgotten. In places like ancient Israel, the goddess Asherah was once worshipped beside Yahweh. She had temples, she had symbols. But over time, her name was stripped away. Her sacred trees were cut down. Her memory was erased by prophets who declared there was only one God, and he was male. This erasure was not just spiritual, it was political. When the divine becomes only male, power follows. Patriarchal societies used religion to justify systems where men ruled over women, where father was the head of the house, where kings spoke for God, where female voices were seen as dangerous, emotional, untrustworthy. And so the stories were changed, the myths rewritten. Goddesses became witches, priestesses became whores. The sacred feminine was turned into something to fear. Even in Christianity, traces of the goddess tried to survive. Mary, the mother of Jesus, became the closest thing to divine womanhood. But even she was trapped in silence, pure, obedient, holy only because she never questioned. Her voice was not the voice of a goddess. It was the echo of a role. And the true feminine divine, the kind that once ruled stars and oceans, disappeared from the altar. But deep beneath the surface, the memory remained, in dreams, in symbols, in the stories of Lilith. She was never a goddess by name, but her defiance carried the spirit of those forgotten queens, the ones who came before Scripture, before kings, before the war on the feminine began. That war has lasted for thousands of years, and it is still not over. But every time a story like Lilith's is remembered, the silence breaks, and the old balance begins to stir. The divine feminine does not need to be invented. She only needs to be found again, because she was never truly gone, just hidden, waiting, in the dark, candlelit corners of medieval Europe, as monks copied sacred texts and priests warned of the fires of hell, another kind of book began to appear. Grimoires, manuals of magic, catalogues of demons. And among the pages filled with curses and forbidden names, one figure began to rise, a woman with wings, a temptress of dreams, a shadow who came at night. Her name was Lilith. And by now, she was no longer remembered as the first woman. She was something else entirely, a succubus, a monster shaped by fear, a symbol twisted by centuries of silence. In medieval demonology, Lilith became a warning, not just against sin, but against women, especially women who owned their bodies, who spoke their desires, who lived outside the rules. The church did not need to prove she existed. They only needed people to believe she might. And so they described her in terrifying detail. Pale skin, long dark hair, eyes that glowed in the dark. She would enter the dreams of men, seduce them while they slept, steal their seed, and vanish before dawn. She was blamed for lust, for nocturnal sins, for thoughts no priest could control. This version of Lilith served a purpose. She became the scapegoat for everything society feared about female sexuality. In a time when women were told to be silent, obedient, and pure, any sign of passion became a threat. A woman who did not belong to a man was dangerous. A woman who enjoyed her body was wicked. A woman who dared to seduce, rather than be seduced, was unnatural. And so Lilith became the story that held all of those fears. A myth used to shame, to control, to punish. Men were taught that impure dreams were not their fault. They were Lilith's doing. A demon had come to them in the night. She was the reason for temptation, the reason for shame. And women were taught to fear her too. Mothers hung amulets over their babies' cradles, etched with protective prayers against her. She was said to steal newborns, attack pregnant women, and bring sickness to those who forgot to guard themselves. Her name became a curse, her image a threat. But behind this mask of horror was still the memory of the woman she once was, the first to say no, the first to leave. And that was the part the church feared the most. Because a demon can be blamed, a demon can be cast out. But an idea, once it takes root, cannot be exorcised. And Lilith had become more than myth. She was now an idea. The idea that a woman could choose her own desire, that she could want more than obedience, that she could exist without permission. By the 14th century, Lilith had become a regular name in demonology. She was said to be the mother of incubi and succubi, the queen of night spirits, the first of the succubi. But those titles were just masks, disguises meant to hide what she had always been. Not evil, just free. And in a world built on control, freedom is the one thing that always looks like danger. Hidden beneath the streets of Vatican City lies a place most people will never see. A vault sealed behind iron doors. A library of shadows. Known as the Vatican Secret Archives, it holds centuries of handwritten scrolls, banned books, forbidden letters, and documents the Church never meant for the world to read. Among these records are names that were erased from public knowledge, names that once carried power, names that could change the way we see history. And one of those names is Lilith. From the very beginning, the Church understood that power lives in stories, the ones you allow and the ones you bury. As Christianity grew, it began to gather and burn the writings it saw as dangerous, not just pagan myths or magical texts, but anything that hinted at another version of creation, another kind of woman, another origin that did not begin with Eve. Lilith was not just a forgotten figure. She was deliberately removed, and her name began to appear on a list few were allowed to see. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. This list began in the 1500s under Pope Paul IV. It was not just a record, it was a weapon, used to silence anything that challenged the Church's authority, scientific works, philosophical ideas, and ancient religious texts that preserved stories too old and too wild for Christian doctrine. Texts like the alphabet of Ben Sira, writings that spoke Lilith's name. These were not just banned, they were locked away, copied by hand, studied in silence, and then hidden from view. Some of these forbidden manuscripts now sit in the secret archives. Others were destroyed. A few escaped, scattered across the world, passed down through private libraries and secret societies. But the message was clear. Lilith's story was not to be taught, not to be spoken, not even to be questioned. Her name became a kind of religious curse, not for what she did, but for what she represented. The idea that there would once been a woman who chose freedom over obedience, and worse, the idea that such a choice was sacred. The censorship ran deep. In some early Christian commentaries, when Lilith's name appeared, scribes would scratch it out, or replace it with code. She was described as the first demon, the dark wife, the night whisperer, but never as a woman, never as equal. By removing her humanity, they removed the threat, and they hoped the world would forget. But the truth cannot stay buried forever. Whispers of Lilith survived, in folklore, in art, in the margins of sacred texts where monks scribbled warnings in tiny ink. Some even carved her name backward, believing it would hide her from the eyes of the church. But they were really trying to hide her from the eyes of time. The Vatican may still keep her name locked behind stone walls and guarded halls, but the fact that they locked it away proves something powerful. Lilith was never just a myth. She was a truth too dangerous to speak out loud. A truth that still waits in silence, unwritten, but never forgotten. During the height of the Inquisition, across Europe, flames lit the skies. Women were dragged from their homes, accused of terrible things, speaking with spirits, flying at night, cursing crops, healing without permission, loving without shame. The church called them witches. But many of these women shared something far more ancient than any spellbook. They carried the same traits once written into the myth of Lilith: independence, knowledge, sexual power. And for that, they were hunted, tortured, burned. Lilith had been cast as a demon, and now any woman who reminded the world of her was treated like one too. The witch hunts began to rise around the late 14th century and peaked during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. But the roots of the panic were older. Deep in church doctrine was the belief that women were spiritually weaker, more easily corrupted, more likely to fall into sin. This belief did not appear overnight. It was built over centuries, layer by layer, beginning with Eve, shaped by fear of Lilith and sharpened by the growing need to control every part of a woman's life. The most infamous manual of the time was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Published in the year 1487 by two German inquisitors, this book became the guide for identifying and destroying witches. Inside its pages, women were blamed for storms, plagues, failed marriages, and impure dreams. The text warned that women had an insatiable carnal desire, that they were disobedient by nature, that they were jealous, cunning, and full of secrets. All the qualities once feared in Lilith were now seen in her so-called daughters. Midwives were targeted, herbalists were accused, widows who owned land, girls who refused marriage, women who lived alone or spoke too freely. All became suspects. It did not matter if they had never cast a spell. What mattered was that they reminded the church of a story it had worked so hard to bury. The story of a woman who walked away from control, who claimed her own knowledge, who did not ask permission. Even the way confessions were extracted echoed that fear. Torture was used to force women to admit to flying with demons, having sex with the devil, and worshipping ancient goddesses. These stories were not always real, but the fear was. And it was old. Fear of women who knew more than they were allowed to, who loved more than they were supposed to, who existed outside the roles assigned to them. Lilith may not have been named during the trials, but her shadow was everywhere. In the fire, in the screams, in the questions asked by men who needed to believe that power in a woman was unnatural, that defiance was evil, that desire itself was a curse. Tens of thousands of women were executed during the witch hunts, maybe more, their names forgotten, their stories twisted. But what they shared was clear. They lived in a world that feared what Lilith symbolized, and in trying to destroy that symbol, the church created centuries of terror. But even flames cannot burn away every truth, and Lilith's daughters still rise, not in fear, but in memory, carrying the story the fire could not erase. Step inside a medieval cathedral and look up. The walls tell stories, not just the ones approved by priests and popes, but secret ones. Stories carved into stone, painted in light, hidden in plain sight. Among the angels and saints, dragons and demons, there are symbols that do not belong. A woman with wild hair and wings, a serpent wrapped around her waist, a naked figure with owl feet standing beside the tree of life. These are not just decorations. They are fragments of something older, traces of a name the church tried to erase. Lilith. During the Middle Ages, art was controlled by the church. Every image in a manuscript, every carving on a column, every piece of stained glass was meant to teach, to inspire devotion, to warn against sin. But artists were not always obedient. Some were scholars, some were rebels, and some were believers in truths that had no place in sermons. So they buried those truths in their work, using code, using symbols, using the language of shape and shadow to keep the forbidden alive. One of the most famous symbols is found in illuminated manuscripts. In the margins of Bibles and prayer books, monks would draw small creatures, sometimes animals, sometimes monsters, but sometimes women with wings, women whose feet ended in talons, women who stood next to Adam, even when the text showed only Eve. These figures were never labeled Lilith, but they matched ancient descriptions, and their presence was not random. They were there to remind the reader that another story existed, a story with a different first woman. In stained glass, Lilith appears as a temptress, not always as the snake, but sometimes as the one beside it. In a few rare windows, the serpent in the garden has the face of a woman. Her eyes are not evil. They are curious. Her expression is not wicked. It is knowing. Some believe this was a silent nod to Lilith, not as a demon, but as the one who first offered knowledge. Even in the architecture itself, clues remain. In certain Gothic cathedrals, you can find carvings of naked women with wings hidden high in the arches. They are not saints. They are not angels. They are something in between. Figures of power that were never given a name. or perhaps given a name too dangerous to say out loud. These hidden images were not just acts of defiance, they were acts of memory, ways to preserve a story that had been cast into darkness. The artists may not have known the full tale of Lilith, but they felt her echo in old texts, in whispered legends, in the questions the official story could not answer. To this day, those symbols remain, weathered by time, faded by sun, but still visible to those who know where to look. They are not proof, but they are clues. Clues left by hands that dared to remember, and eyes that saw what history tried to hide. That before Eve, there was someone else, and even if her name was forbidden, her image could still speak. In glass, in stone, in light, hidden within the mystical teachings of Judaism lies a different kind of truth. A truth too deep for temples, too wild for doctrine. A truth that refuses to be bound by rules or erased by fear. It is found in the ancient texts of Kabbalah, a spiritual tradition that looks beyond the surface of the Torah and into the soul of the universe. And within that hidden world, Lilith is not simply a demon. She is something much more complex. A cosmic force, a spiritual archetype, a mirror of both danger and wisdom. She is the forbidden feminine in her rawest form. Kabbalah is not like other religious teachings. It doesn't deal in black and white. It moves through mystery, through layers of hidden meanings, through symbols that shift and evolve. In these texts, the universe is shaped by 10 emanations of divine light called the Sephirot, each one representing an aspect of God's energy. Some are masculine, some are feminine. Together, they create balance. But when that balance is broken, chaos is born. And that is where Lilith enters. According to the Kabbalistic texts of the 13th and 14th centuries, Lilith is not just a figure from Genesis. She is part of the spiritual structure of reality. She represents the shadow side of the feminine, the part that refuses to be contained. In the Zohar, one of the central books of Kabbalah, Lilith is described as the consort of Samael, a dark angel often compared to Satan. But their union is not simple evil. It is the reflection of imbalance, a pairing born when divine harmony is lost. In this view, Lilith becomes a necessary part of the spiritual world, not because she is good, but because she reveals what happens when the sacred feminine is rejected. She becomes the rage of what has been silenced, the power of what has been denied. Kabbalists did not worship her, but they did not ignore her either. They studied her, feared her, respected her, because in their eyes, Lilith held a key to understanding the whole. She was not just a temptress, she was a teacher, a spirit who could destroy or awaken, a force that could bring chaos or reveal hidden truths. Some Kabbalistic traditions even taught that Lilith could be redeemed, that when the masculine and feminine were healed and reunited, her wildness would become wisdom. Her exile would end. This version of Lilith is not found in mainstream Judaism. It exists in the secret currents beneath, in the circles of mystics and scholars who dared to ask what lies beyond the surface of the sacred. And what they found was a story too deep to dismiss. In Kabbalah, Lilith is not erased, she is studied, as a symbol of imbalance, as a challenge to purity, as a question that cannot be answered with laws or fear. She is the face of the feminine when it is cast out, and the shadow that returns when it is forgotten. To understand her is to understand what happens when the divine is divided, and to remember her is to begin the work of healing that divide. There is something ancient in the fear of a woman who cannot be controlled. A fear that does not come from evil, but from power. Not the kind of power that crushes, the kind that chooses, that says no, that walks away. For the Church, no figure captured that fear more than Lilith. Not Satan, not the serpent, not even the fallen angels. Lilith alone represented a threat more personal, a seduction not born of wickedness, but of freedom. She was the woman who did not ask permission, and that made her more dangerous than any devil. From the early days of Christian teaching, the image of the ultimate tempter was not always male. In sermons and paintings, in stained glass and stone carvings, it was often a woman who lured the soul into ruin. Her weapon was not war or violence. It was desire, but not just sexual desire. It was the desire for autonomy, for knowledge, for the forbidden truth that there was something more than obedience. And no figure carried that idea more clearly than Lilith. She was often painted, beside Adam or behind him, not as a partner, but as a warning, a shadow in the background, her eyes too knowing, her smile too calm. The Church taught that women were the weaker vessel, easier to tempt, easier to fall. But Lilith flipped that script. She was not the tempted. She was the one who refused, the one who would not kneel. And that turned her into the perfect symbol of fear. Not because she was monstrous, but because she was untamed. This fear was deeply rooted in the Church's growing control over society. As the centuries passed, leaders used theology to define every part of a woman's life, from her dress to her voice to her silence. A woman's virtue was tied to her submission, her holiness to her obedience. Lilith broke all of that. She had no husband, no master, no children to redeem her. She was whole without them, and that was unacceptable. So she was recast, not just as a demon, but as the origin of seduction itself. They said she whispered into the dreams of men, that she lured monks from their vows, that she stirred sinful thoughts with a glance. And yet, it wasn't lust they feared most. It was choice. Lilith was the embodiment of what happened when a woman chose herself over a man, herself over heaven, herself over fear. In this way, Lilith became a mirror, not just for women, but for a Church afraid of what it could not control. She revealed the cracks in the story, the questions that would not go away. What if obedience is not the highest virtue? What if desire is not a curse? What if freedom is not sin? Lilith was never Satan, but in many ways she played the role better, not by tempting, but by leaving. And her absence echoed louder than any fire and brimstone. She became the silence that made people uneasy, the missing piece the Church tried to hide behind dogma. But a story this old cannot be buried forever, especially when it speaks to something so human, the fear of a woman who cannot be owned, and the truth that she never needed to be. The Renaissance was a time of light, breaking through centuries of shadow. Across Europe, artists, poets, and philosophers began to search for truth outside the walls of the Church. Ancient texts were dusted off, forgotten languages were studied, lost stories were brought back to life. And among those stories, quietly, carefully, a name began to reappear: Lilith. Not as a demon, not as a curse, but as a symbol, a mystery, a presence that could no longer be ignored. During the 14th and 15th centuries, scholars began to translate Old Hebrew and Sumerian manuscripts. They explored Jewish mysticism, pagan myths, and the writings of early philosophers. Hidden in these ancient pages were whispers of a woman who had once stood beside Adam, a woman erased by time, a woman who refused to obey. Renaissance thinkers were fascinated, not because they believed in demons, but because Lilith represented an idea too powerful to forget. The idea that history had been edited, that something sacred had been removed. Artists began to place her in their work, not always by name, but by image. A woman with long, flowing hair, a serpent curling around her legs, eyes filled with both danger and knowledge. She appeared in paintings as the darker counterpart to Eve, the twin no one talked about. Sometimes she was the snake in Eden. Other times she stood in the background, watching, waiting. In the works of painters like Michelangelo and Albrecht Dürer, symbols of Lilith began to surface. Quiet, but intentional. Writers followed. Poets like Dante hinted at her in coded lines. In his Divine Comedy, Lilith is never called directly, but the idea of a seductive night demon appears in the Inferno, a being whose sin is not cruelty or violence, but autonomy. Later, English poets like John Milton would take this further. In Paradise Lost, Eve is given a complexity that echoes Lilith. She questions, she chooses, she reflects something older, something buried. These were not accidents. They were quiet rebellions. Even within the church, certain thinkers began to question the silence around Lilith. Scholars of Kabbalah explored her as part of a divine balance. Humanists argued that women had been misrepresented for centuries, and some theologians wondered if the story of Eden had more layers than they had been allowed to see. But they knew the risks. To speak Lilith's name too loudly was to challenge the entire foundation of Christian womanhood. So they hid her in symbols, in metaphors, in footnotes and margins. They trusted that curious minds would find her, that future generations would connect the pieces. The Renaissance did not restore Lilith to the spotlight, but it opened the door. It gave artists and thinkers the tools to question, to remember, to imagine, and in doing so, it planted the seeds of rediscovery, seeds that would take centuries to grow. But even then, Lilith was still there, in the ink, in the brushstrokes, in the questions whispered between pages. The woman before Eve was no longer forgotten. She had returned, not in sermons, but in secrets. And sometimes, secrets speak louder than scripture. In the dry sands of ancient Mesopotamia, under layers of earth untouched for thousands of years, something began to surface. Not a myth, not a story, but evidence. Carved in clay, pressed in stone, hidden in the ruins of temples older than the Bible itself. Archaeologists working across Israel, Iraq, and Syria began unearthing artifacts that spoke of a figure long erased by the church, a woman with wings, a guardian of the night, a name etched in languages older than Latin, Lilith. One of the most striking discoveries came from ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq. On a tablet dating back to around 2000 BCE, a female figure stands with wings stretched wide, bird-like feet, and lions by her side. Her head is crowned, her stare unblinking. Many scholars believe this figure represents Lilitu, a predecessor to Lilith, known from early Akkadian and Babylonian mythology. She is not depicted as evil. She is powerful, mysterious, independent, and very much present in the sacred imagery of her time. Other discoveries came in the form of protective amulets. In areas across modern-day Israel, archaeologists uncovered household charms dating from the 7th to the 10th centuries. Many were written in Aramaic or early Hebrew, and were meant to ward off evil spirits. One common threat these amulets warned against was Lilith. Her name is clearly inscribed. sometimes alongside images of women in chains or with outstretched arms. These artifacts show not just belief, but fear. A deep cultural memory that this being was real enough to guard against, but also remembered enough to be known by name. In Syria, fragments of Canaanite texts revealed even earlier echoes, stories of goddesses and night spirits bearing striking similarities to the Lilith figure. These weren't Christian, they weren't Jewish, they were something older. They belonged to a time before the church had drawn its lines between sacred and profane. And in that time, feminine power was not yet labelled as evil. It simply was. These archaeological finds cannot be denied. They are not folklore. They are not legend passed by word of mouth. They are carved in clay, fired in kilns, buried under temples and palaces. They outlasted empires. And now they rise again with each shovel of dirt, each cleaned inscription, each museum label that forces a new question. If Lilith was only a myth, why is she found in so many places? If she was only a demon, why is she crowned like a queen? The church has long kept her name locked in silence. But the earth does not lie. The earth remembers what people try to forget. And it remembers Lilith. Not as a whisper, but as a fact, a truth carved into the bones of civilization. These artifacts are not just relics, they are proof that the first woman walked this world before the texts said she did, that her story was told long before it was erased. And now, piece by piece, that story is being put back together. Not by priests, but by hands covered in dust. By eyes that see what has always been there, waiting. Lilith has always lived between the lines, not just in sacred texts or whispered myths, but in literature, in poetry, in the dreams of writers who felt something missing in the world they were told to believe in. Over the centuries, artists and poets began to breathe life back into her name, not as a monster, but as something deeper, a symbol of what it means to stand alone, to choose freedom, even when the world calls that freedom a sin. In the 17th century, John Milton gave the world his masterpiece, Paradise Lost. Though Lilith is never named directly, her spirit moves through the character of Eve and the fallen angels. In some later interpretations, she appears as the shadow beneath the garden, the unspoken first wife who walked away before Eve ever opened her eyes. Milton's epic made space for questions about obedience, about rebellion, about the cost of knowledge. And in that space, Lilith's silence started to crack. Then came Goethe, the German poet and playwright. In his legendary work, Faust, written in the early 19th century, Lilith appears not as a demon, but as a dangerous beauty, a woman whose charm cannot be resisted. In the Walpurgisnacht scene, she is called the first wife of Adam. Her hair, it is said, is the net that catches men. Goethe did not write this to condemn her. He was fascinated by her, by what she represented. A freedom that defies explanation, a woman who belongs to no one. The pre-Raphaelite painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti brought her into full view. In his painting, Lady Lilith, and the accompanying poem, he portrays her not as a threat, but as a goddess of beauty. Her power is in her presence, in the way she gazes into a mirror, unconcerned with anyone's judgment. Rossetti's Lilith is not evil. She is self-aware, self-possessed. She is what happens when a woman chooses herself. And that made her unforgettable. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, esoteric groups like the Theosophists and occult societies began to reclaim Lilith openly. They saw her not as a demon, but as a lost symbol, of divine feminine energy. To them, she was the other side of the spiritual coin, the darkness that balances light, the chaos that births new creation. Some even connected her to the moon, the hidden side of nature, the mystery that cannot be tamed by rules or dogma. These writers and thinkers did not agree on who Lilith was, but they all sensed the same thing, that she was more than the stories had allowed, that behind the warnings and curses was a woman who had once said no, a woman who had walked away from paradise to become something the world could not name. In literature and myth, Lilith became a mirror, a reflection of every person who had ever questioned the story they were given. She was a flame, a shadow, a voice in the dark. And through the hands of poets and artists she returned, not as a ghost, but as a symbol, a misunderstood guide for those still learning how to be free. Lilith never truly disappeared. Her name was buried, her story twisted, her image turned into something to fear. But she was never gone, and in the modern world she is returning, not as a villain, not as a shadow, but as the symbol she was always meant to be. In feminism, psychology, and spiritual movements across the globe, Lilith is being reclaimed, not just as a myth, but as a mirror, a reminder of the first woman who dared to walk away. In the rise of modern feminism during the 20th century, scholars and activists began to dig beneath the surface of history. They searched for the stories that had been erased, the voices silenced by tradition. And again, they found Lilith, a woman who refused to submit, who demanded to be seen as equal, who chose exile over obedience. Feminists saw in her not a demon, but a sister, someone whose rebellion wasn't sin, but survival, a symbol of strength that came before the fall. Writers like Judith Plaskow brought Lilith back into focus. In her groundbreaking mid-70s poem, The Coming of Lilith, she reimagined the meeting between Eve and Lilith not as rivals, but as sisters in resistance. In her version, Lilith is not the enemy. She is the truth, the part of Eve that had been stolen, the part that remembers what it means to be free. This new Lilith did not belong to the past. She belonged to every woman who had ever felt erased. In psychology, the image of Lilith found new meaning through the work of Carl Jung and other depth psychologists. Jung saw Lilith as an archetype, a symbol of the rejected feminine, the part of the psyche that holds rage, sensuality, creativity, and power. When suppressed, she becomes destructive. But when acknowledged, she becomes a source of healing. In dreams, she often appears as a guide or a warning, not to be feared, but to be understood. Spiritual movements also began to welcome Lilith back into sacred space. In Wiccan traditions, goddess worship, and modern Kabbalistic circles, she is honored not as a demon, but as an aspect of divine feminine energy. She represents independence, mystery, the night, the untamed side of the soul. She is the goddess of threshold moments, of transformation, of truth that cannot be tamed. Even pop culture has embraced her. In music, film, television, and art, Lilith now appears not as a monster, but as a muse. Powerful, complicated, human. The Lilith Fair, a concert tour that began in the late 1990s, was named in her honor, created by female musicians to celebrate women's voices. It was more than music. It was a statement that the first woman had returned, and she had something to say. Lilith's story is no longer one of shame. It is a call, a challenge, a chance to look at the stories we are told and ask who benefits when certain voices are silenced. In her return, Lilith offers something we all need, the reminder that rebellion can be sacred, that exile can be freedom, and that the first woman was never truly gone. She was waiting. Not in the garden, but in us. Lilith was not erased because she was evil. She was erased because she was equal. In the earliest stories, she stood beside Adam, not beneath him. She was formed from the same earth, given the same breath, shaped by the same hands. But when she refused to lie beneath him, when she spoke the secret name of God and chose exile over submission, she became dangerous, not to heaven, but to the story being built by men who needed obedience to be divine. The early church was not just shaping faith, it was shaping structure. Power had to flow in one direction, from God to man to woman, from priest to flock, from king to subject. There was no room in this chain for someone like Lilith. She broke the order by existing, by speaking, by leaving. She did not fall like Eve. She rose. She did not sin. She chose. And for that, she had to be removed. Her equality made her a threat. If Lilith was made from the same dust as Adam, then she was not his possession. She was his match, his mirror. She challenged the idea that men were first, stronger, closer to God. That challenge was too dangerous. It unraveled the hierarchy, and if the first woman did not submit, then why should any woman after her? Her autonomy made her a problem. Lilith left Eden on her own. She was not tempted. She was not tricked. She made a choice. That kind of power was unthinkable in a theology built on obedience. Women were taught to be silent, to serve, to bear children, to support their husbands. Lilith did none of that. She had no children, no master. She created herself. And that made her uncontrollable. Her defiance sealed her fate. The church could tolerate repentance. Even Eve was forgiven. But Lilith never asked for forgiveness. She never returned. She stood outside the system and refused to be tamed. That made her the perfect scapegoat, a symbol of what happens when women step out of line. She was turned into a monster, a succubus, a thief of children. Her name was linked to nightmares, her image twisted into a warning. But the truth beneath that fear was always the same. She said no, and that terrified those who built their power on yes. The church buried her, because she was the question they could not answer. If the first woman was free, then what does that say about the roles that came after? If Lilith chose exile over obedience, then is obedience really sacred? These questions could not be allowed. So they were covered with silence, her name removed from scripture, her story labeled heresy, her symbols hidden in shadows. But erasing someone from a book does not erase them from memory. Lilith's story lived on in whispers, in symbols, in the corners of cathedrals and the margins of manuscripts. And now it lives again, not as a demon, not as a curse, but as the truth. The church buried her because they feared her. And in doing so, they proved exactly how powerful she truly was. They say the first woman was Eve, that she was born from Adam's rib, soft and obedient, made to be his helper, that she fell because she reached for something forbidden. But there was another woman before her, one who didn't fall, one who rose, one who walked out of paradise, not because she was tempted, but because she refused to kneel. Her name was Lilith, and her story is not one of sin. It is one of freedom. She was made from the same dust as Adam, shaped by the same hands, breathed into with the same divine spirit, equal in form, equal in soul. But when Adam demanded her submission, Lilith refused. She would not lie beneath him. She would not shrink to fit a role she did not choose. So she spoke the name of God, a secret name, a name that carried power. And with it she left, not banished, not cast out. She chose to go. She walked away from a paradise where she was not free. That choice changed everything. It threatened the very foundation of the world the church would later build. A world where obedience was virtue, where silence was strength, where woman was second. Lilith broke all of it with one step beyond the gates. She did not wait for punishment. She did not beg to return. She became something else, a symbol of what cannot be owned. So they erased her. They turned her into a demon, a nightmare, a whisper in the dark. They said she stole babies, that she poisoned men in their sleep, that she was lust, that she was chaos. But underneath those lies was a truth too dangerous to keep in the open. The truth that the first woman was not a failure. She was a rebel. And her greatest sin was not disobedience. It was independence. For thousands of years, her name stayed hidden, passed through shadows, carved into amulets, painted in secret corners of cathedrals. She became the spirit behind the witch, the goddess behind the myth, the question no one wanted to answer. Why would a woman choose exile over Eden? Now, in a world still wrestling with those same fears, Lilith returns, not as a monster, but as a mirror. She stands for every voice silenced, every story rewritten, every soul told to stay small. She is not just a symbol for women. She is a symbol for anyone who's ever been told their freedom was too loud. Lilith didn't fall from grace. She rose into her own. She chose freedom over comfort, truth over silence, herself over a paradise built on submission. And that choice was so powerful, it had to be erased. But stories have a way of surviving. And Lilith's story is no longer in the margins. It is rising, speaking, walking again, not back into Eden, but into a world finally ready to hear her name.